So, how on earth do you make a 2D platforming game in 2023? And if you're already familiar with the channel, you will know that I prefer to create my games with Unity, and that I have already created a whole playlist on how to implement all the single mechanics of your favorite platforming games. And in this video, I want to kind of summarize how I put all of these together in order to create this platformer demo. But before we start, please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into it. And normally, when thinking of 2D platformers, you'd probably think about jumping being the most important mechanic of all. But there's one thing I wanted to do before, and that's to create a player with the basic ability to go left and right. So here you can see me adding a new sprite to my Unity project by clicking right and selecting 2D object and then some kind of sprite. And created my first script with the name player script that I attached to my game object. And don't worry, you won't need to do any programming, since I've linked all of my scripts below the respective videos. So in the player script was adding a new variable for the speed of our player, and then I used transform the translate with the horizontal input axis times our speed in delta time, which is the time that passed since the last frame, in order to make up for lower FPS devices. And at that point I was already able to move left and right. Next, I finally wanted to add jumping to my platformer. In order to do that, I noticed that I needed to add a rigid body component to my player to make him fall down, and a box collider so that he won't fall through my platforms. And in my script, I added a jump parameter, and as soon as the player presses down the jump button, I needed to get access to my rigid body component to add some vertical force to it. But then I realized that I'm now able to jump infinitely, so I added this function to make sure that the player is grounded before performing the next jump. And then it suddenly started to work just as I wanted. But then, the game still looked pretty clumsy. So in my third video, I wanted to add some walking animations to my player. And what I did is accessing the animator window in Unity, and by using automatic keyframes, reduce my player's horizontal scale, so he starts to wiggle when moving left or right. Then I played a bit with the speed of it, and in my code, as soon as we have some kind of horizontal input, play the corresponding animation. And that's when I started to actually like the results. And next up, to improve it even further, I decided to add a jump animation to our player as well. So in my animation, I increased my player's vertical size, so he kind of stretches when performing a jump. And in my code, I needed to play it as soon as the player hit the jump button. But this time, I didn't really enjoy the result. And that's because my newly created jump animation didn't play at all. So what I needed to do is to make sure that it does only play my walking animation when on the ground, so that it doesn't cancel out my jump animation. And that looked like what you can see right here. And then soon I was happy with it again. Finally, what's a platforming game without platforms? So in Unity, I enabled grid snapping and added a new sprite with another box collider to it as my first platforms that soon formed in combination with some walls, my first level. The mechanic I want to show you next is something you might eventually not even notice at first sight, and that is a parallax background like this one. And as you can imagine, I couldn't resist creating one of those myself, so I added an empty game object and then added some sprites to it, whose render order I made negative to form some kind of levels, just like that. And at the end, all that I had left to do was to create a new script and to attach it to all of my background elements that I wanted to move. In my script, I calculated the offset that my background elements currently had to my player, and then I slightly moved them to the left or the right, depending on the intensity of my effect. And as soon as they got too far to the left or right, I wanted them to reappear on the screen. And if you're interested, that is what my final result looked like, which I was pretty surprised by. Now at the next step, I wanted to implement the mechanic that I was afraid of the most, although it turned out to be quite easy, and that's what you can see in this clip, ledge grabbing. I remembered that the easiest way to do it is to emit two rays from your player, and if the lower one hits an object while the upper one doesn't, I wanted to play my ledge grab animation, making the player rise on top of the ledge. So here you can see me emitting the two rays, whose position I need to change depending on where the player is headed. And then, if our preferred circumstances are met, I want to play the animation for our ledge grab, which I made by moving the player upwards until it hits a certain height, and then moving it to the left or right. Finally, that was already it. In this video, I would like to skip, although it's my most popular one at the moment, and that's because it just shows you a better way to organize your code. So from that point, my Unity inspector started to look nicely organized, as you can see here, which really reminded me that no matter how good your game becomes, your most important program is really yourself, so make sure to make it enhance continuously. So now taking a look at spikes, which if you know the game in the background, you should know pretty well, and how I added them to my own game is by creating a new game object with a collider and in its script inside the onCollisionEnter function that gets called as soon as some kind of collision happens. I needed to make sure that my colliding game object is actually the player, and if so, I unfortunately needed to tell him to die, which in my player script I defined by playing a death animation and then respawning at the very origin of its position. And as you can see here, my death animation really wasn't too scary, as it just shrank down the player before he popped up at its respawn point again. And yeah, about this video, please just don't mind about it, as it was just some kind of gag to celebrate the release of a much anticipated game. So yeah, as you can see, I added Ultrahand to my platformer by creating this box with an event trigger on it, and in my code, as soon as I hold left, I wanted to calculate my mouse cursor's position in Unity to make my dragged object follow my mouse. And then, because it sounded like a funny idea to me, I made the object rotate by 45 degrees as soon as you would use scrolling wheel. And at the very end, I added this funny little animation to it, which I love to see, even now when editing this video. So now, back to some platforming stuff. I finally decided to add some sound effects to my game, and as you can see here, I was showing you two different methods in order to do that, but the easiest variant was to just add this play sound function that takes an audio clip and then plays it through the audio source that I needed to add to my player game object. Then what I really enjoyed is adding these events to my animations, which would then call my play audio function, so I could just drag the sound that I wanted to play right here. And then a few days later, I drew this funny sprite with no other purpose than serving as some kind of goal for my levels. So I attached this sprite to a new game object and added a script to it that detects whenever a player gets close to it. And if that's the case, I created this simple UI that shows up as soon as I finish the level. And because that wasn't enough for me, I've created this menu as well and made sure that only the buttons for the levels that I already finished show up, plus my current level, which at the end looked like this. So now to the mechanic that you probably already started to miss, and that is double jump. And since I wanted my player to perform a double jump like this, I needed to add a max jumps variable, a current jumps variable that I decided to refresh to my max jumps whenever I hit the ground, and then obviously each time I performed a jump I had to decrease my current jumps by 1. And that was already what I wanted. And to make things a bit more exciting, I got myself to add these exciting like jump crystals to a platformer as well, which turned out to be just adding a new game object with a sprite and a collider and in its script. As you can see here, check if it's the player that is colliding with our crystal, and if so, telling him to regain one of its jumps, but only if that wouldn't exceed its maximum jumps. And then I realized that my Unity project really started to look like something. So next I wanted to add some action to it, and that's when I began to create this bullet that in its script I told to move upwards until it hits something, and if it's a breakable object, like a wall, to destroy it. And as you can see here, for the fun of it, I also added a second variant, so I could shoot my bullets at the direction to my mouse cursor, which then ended up to look like this. And the final mechanic that I decided to add is probably what you like the most, and that's enemies, or more specifically this slimy stranger that you can see right here, which luckily was really just a game object similar to my player, but in its script I needed to tell it to move towards the player as soon as he enters our viewport, which is really just a circular distance, and if we hit our player we want to make him respawn. And then, because it's the attack you all love the most, I added a jump attack to it that I wanted to repeat after a certain cooldown, and that just consisted of adding some vertical force to our enemy, similar to our player at the very beginning. So now again, if you want to have the scripts that I made, or just some additional details, please check out the videos, or feel free to ask me in the comments. And now hopefully you got an impression of which platformer mechanics you could add to your own platformer, and how to do that in general, and have a nice one.